We're going to be learning as a schus for Shlema for Ilana Chaya Basarach. We are on Daf Haf Amud Beis, about 15 lines from the bottom. We'd said in the Mishnah, Ein moichel lehem b'mechubel karka, av moichel hu shemisha yiktzeit. Tanakama says you can't sell mechubel karka, but once it's cut off, you could sell it. Yehuda I'm a moichel hu amanas lakos. Yehuda said you could even sell. You could even sell something that is mechuber if you make a deal with the purchaser that he's going to cut it down. It means you're not selling mechuber in the end. This is the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. Rabbi Meir, I mean, this is a brisa that's really repeating the machlokes of our Mishnah. Meir, I mean, so the brisa, the first example of brisa is a tree, which our Mishnah had not said any specific thing. It just said it said the machlokes about whether you could rent, whether you can sell something that's attached to the ground. This brisa now is saying the same machlokes and saying it specifically about a tree. That Rabbi Yehuda says you could sell it if if the deal is that the purchaser is going to cut it down, so it's not going to remain mechuber. He says it must be already pre-cut in order for you to be allowed to sell. As we know, the Isser is you're not allowed to sell property in Eretz Yisrael. So as long as it's attached, it's considered like you sold property.
I'm sorry, where are we up to?
We are on Daf Chaf Amud Beis, about 15 lines from the bottom. Shachas Amanas Ligzois, the Goizes. If we're going to have the same machlokes, if not about a tree, but about shachas. Shachas is early stages of a tvua that at this point is only used for animal fodder. If you let it grow, it's going to, I think that's what it is, that if you let it grow, it's going to eventually become more useful. It's going to be more. It's like partially grown fodder, food that goes for animals. But if you wait, you leave it in the ground, it's going to get better. So we say amanas ligzais gazes shachas amanas ligzais. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I lost the place. Shachas amanas ligzais gazes. Rabbi Yehuda says you can sell, you're allowed to sell that. Meir, like his sheet in the Mishnah, and like by Elon, he says it has to be already cooked. Kama amnas liksar v'kaitzer, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says the same thing about grain that is already at the final stages, that it just needs to be harvested. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, if you sell it to a guy and tell the guy that you have to cut it off, then that's considered to be good enough. It's not considered attached to the ground. Therefore, you're allowed to sell it to an Ovid Kechavim. It has to be already cut. Utricha. We need all three cases. Yashmin and Elon. If we just said the case of a tree, on that Rameir said it's aser, unless it doesn't help to make a deal that the purchaser, the guy is going to cut it down or take off, you cut down the tree, since keeping the tree does not damage it and anything, I'll maintain the tree and I'll do it later. But Lagabi, we mean specifically Lagabi the kama, Lagabi the standing grain. Once it's ready to be harvested, leaving it out risks that it's going to get spoiled. So the chimashile pasid, if the longer you leave it out, the more likely it's going to damage. He'll agree to Rabbi Yehuda. Even Rameh would agree that if you make a deal that he's going to cut it, since we can expect the guy will do so, it's mutter. Yashmin bahani tarti. If we would just say the tree and the standing grain, mishum delo yadayid shvechai, because although the tree there's no damage. There's also no advantage of waiting. You want to get the wood's not going to get any better. Avol shachas, the idea shvachayu, that you know that it's going to improve if you leave it. It's only a third grown. You'll have a lot more fodder for your animals. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda agrees to Remeir that it's more likely the guy, even though he agreed he's going to cut it down, he won't do so. And if we just said the case of Shachas, maybe just the case of Shachas or Meir said that it's usher because we expect that he's not going to do what he promised and cut it down. But maybe the other two, he's Maidir Yehuda, Tzricha. Therefore, we needed all of them. Ibayalu. Behema almanas lishchait mao. We were talking till now about trees, and the purchaser is making a promise that he's going to cut it down. What about if he sold him an animal, which we said you're not allowed to sell a behema gasa to Ovid Kechavim, but you make a Tanai that it should be he has to shecht it, which then avoids the problem that he's going to use it on Shabbos or whatever the problem might be. Sometime in my Shari Rabbi Yehuda, why does Rabbi Yehuda over here in our Mishnah say that it's mutter the labashusa kamelema the masimashalu? Because in the end, even though you're selling, let's say, the payers of a tree, or you're selling a tree, or you're selling your standing grain, or whatever the case may be, you still own the land. So if the non-Jew does not follow the deal, then it's ultimately up to the owner. He can cut it down against his will. But maybe Lagabi the behema, once it's in the guy, he has it, he'll do whatever he wants. Or maybe Rabbi Yehuda holds that in either case. So Gemara Toshma, the Tanya behema amnas lishchet v'shaychet, the Rabbi Yehuda we see that the Gemara, the Brisa says explicitly that the machlekes remainder Yehuda is also Lagabi a behema amnas lishchet. Zok the Mishnah. Okay, this Mishnah is you ever heard the I think we've come across the din, we've come across many times the din that we don't make a gzera. And then there's the corollary of that whenever the Gemara wants to make a gzera, it always says that it's chakula chad gzeri. So this is going to be one of those Gemaras. And surprisingly, we never get to the Kula Chad Gzeri. I kept on waiting for it for the next block, and it never came up. So let's see. It's a little bit of a cheshbon. The Mishnah says, Ein maskirin lahem batim be'eretz Yisrael. First, we're going to say the Shita of Reb Meir, the Tanakama, and then we're going to say the Shita of Reb Yossi. So the Shita of Reb Meir is you're not allowed to rent a house to a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael. And it goes without saying that one cannot rent to a guy in Eretz Yisrael sada. So the bottom, the reason why is because there's actually no problem. We're not talking about the kind of schira that we've been talking about in the past. We're talking about, I'm sorry, let's go back. We had spoken about earlier that if you rent animals, that you have a problem of that maybe they'll use the animals on Shabbos. Now we're talking about renting property. So renting a house, we immediately come up with the problem of lois echanim, that you're not allowed to sell property to a guy. Now we're talking about renting. So renting is obviously a gzeira, that if you allow someone to rent a property in Eretz Yisrael, they'll come to sell it to them. So that's the gzeira why ein maskin lehem bottom Eretz Yisrael according to Remei. Ve'ein tzarich lehem sadis. Then we say in addition to that you can't rent sadis, and we say ein tzarich lehem because sadis have an additional problem, like we're going to say in the Gemara when you rent a field to a guy. You could he's not going to. If you then sell it to him, when you sell a field, it's going to stop that field from having Meiser taken off of it, and we discourage avoidance of Meiser. I think this might be. I'm wondering if this might be the root of the problem with the way people get around Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael, because of this halacha that one is not supposed to avoid Meiser. Maybe you're not supposed to avoid Shemitah as well. Zak the Gemara. Okay, so that's the Tanna Kama says in Eretz Yisrael itself, you're not allowed to rent or sell. I'm sorry, you can't rent either a house or a field. A house because of loisechanim, and a sada because of gzeira of loisechanim if you sell it, and a sada because of gzeiras of both loisechanim as well as stopping the sada from producing ma'aser. Ubesurya maskirin lehem batim, renting a house is allowed. As the Gemara is going to conclude, we hold Syria. Syria is right near Eretz Yisrael. David HaMelech, when he became king, he conquered Syria, and it's a machlekes about whether Syria, since it was only conquered by an individual, by David HaMelech, whether that is considered to be folded into Eretz Yisrael. It has the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. So the Tanna Kama says it's not part of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore you can rent a house because there's no, even if you would sell, there's no Isser of Loisechonim. Avaloi Sadis, but you can't rent a field. Zak the Gemara, since because they were scared, if you allow them to rent in Syria, you might come to rent in Eretz Yisrael as well. Now, renting in Eretz Yisrael, what's the problem? Like we said before, renting is not a problem. But if you rent in Eretz Yisrael, you could come to sell in Eretz Yisrael. And like we said, since there are two issues with selling in Eretz Yisrael, the Chacham Geyser, even the Gzeira, that you can't rent in Syria, because you might come to rent in Eretz Yisrael, and if you rent in Eretz Yisrael, you might come to sell in Eretz Yisrael. So it's almost like a math equation. If you have two Isurim, that allows you to make a Gzeira. For one Isur, you only make a single Gzeira. For two Isurim, you make a Gzeira. Chutz la'aretz means places that are further away than Syria. Moichron lehem batim, you can even sell a house, because what are you scared? You're scared that if you sell a house in Chutz la'aretz, you're going to sell it also in Eretz Yisrael. It's very far away. People won't make that mistake. Umaskirin sadis, and you can rent a field, but you can't sell a field, since there are two things, since there are two isurim, even though it's far away. We are still scared if you're allowed to sell a sada, since there's two isurim in Eretz Yisrael. We're scared if you sell in Chutz la'aretz, you'll come to sell in Eretz Yisrael and be over on two isurim. Divrei Reb Meir, that's Reb Meir. Rabbi Yossi Yomer, and I'm speaking out, I think, a lot of what the Gemara says, because otherwise it's hard even to remember this and understand it without some context. Rabbi Yossi Yomer, Eretz Yisrael maskirin lehem batim, avaloi sadis. Rabbi Yossi says everything is a little bit more makel than Reb Meir. So he says you can rent a house in Eretz Yisrael, since it's only one Isser. He's not concerned of the Gzeira. And the Gemara will explain Rabbi Yossi's reasoning as we go along. Rabbi Yossi says, you can rent a house. We're not concerned about the Gzeira that maybe you'll come to sell a house and loisechanim. Avaloi sadis has two things. You can sell a house and certainly rent it. Umaskirin sadis, you could rent a house. So it comes out that Syria is going to have the same din, according to Rabbi Yossi, is going to have the same din that Chutz la'aretz had, according to Reb Meir. B'chutz la'aretz moichrin elu ve'elu, and b'chutz la'aretz, neither of them are asa. You can sell both. Then the Gemara says, Af b'makom she'amru lahaskir, even in those places that we said it's mutter, that it's mutter to rent. So we're talking about, I'm sorry. Yeah, Af b'makom she'amru lahaskir, even those places where we said you could rent a house, loyal beis dira amru, you still can't rent it as to be used as a residence. You can only rent it for commercial purposes. That it's because you're bringing into it avodas kechavim. The guy is going to bring in avodas kechavim, and it still belongs to you, and he's bringing in an actual getchka into your house, so that's asa. Another din. And additionally, you cannot rent to a non-Jew a beis hamerchatz nikra al shmai, because, as the Gemara will explain this a little bit better, but if you rent a beis hamerchatz to a guy, it's still going to be called Yaeli Cohen's beis hamerchatz, and people are going to see the guy working in the beis hamerchatz on Shabbos, and they'll say, "Oh, Yael Cohen, that Shegitz hired a guy to work in his beis hamerchatz on Shabbos." So because of that marasayin, we're not allowed to rent a beis hamerchatz. Sagt the Gemara, "Ma'in tzarich lo'em mesadas." The Mishnah had said, according to Reb Meir, that you can't rent a house in Eretz Yisrael, and you certainly can't rent a sada. Ilay mishum de'ispatarti, if you'll say, because there are two isurim in karka. Chada chanias karka. One is loisechanim, that you're giving over property in Eretz Yisrael. Chada chamafka lo mimaiser. And secondly, that you're stopping meiser from being taken from this property by renting it out. The guy is no longer going to pay meiser. So this means when you sell it, we assur it from being rented, because if you'll sell it, there'll be both the isser of lois echanim as well as the isser of stopping it from paying meiser. So fragt die Gemara, you're stopping the person from putting on a mezuzah. If we do the same way, we don't want to reduce the ma'aser taken, we should want to not reduce the mitzvah of mezuzah. He says, no, the chiyuv of mezuzah is not that a house has to have a mezuzah. The din is that a person who lives in a house, he has a chiyuv that he has to have mezuzah on the house he lives in. So when you sell it to a guy, there's no chiyuv mezuzah. But meiser is a chiyuv on the land. The person who lives there, he's the one who has to carry out that chiyuv. But there's a din meiser on land owned by a Jew. So when you sell that land, it loses its chiyuv meiser, and that's a reduction in the meiser. Mashenkin, when a person sells a house to a guy and therefore doesn't have a mezuzah, he'll have to put a mezuzah wherever he does live. But it does not consider to be attached to the land, that the land has been downgraded, that it no longer has a chiyuv mezuzah. So therefore, we remain that there is a second isser with selling land in Eretz Yisrael, that you're reducing it from meiser.
So that means you can't even sell it to Ger Toshav. That means you can't even sell the land to Ger Toshav, not just Ovid Kachavim.
A Ger Toshav isn't Ovid Kachavim. Right, there would be no difference between an Ovid Kachavim or a Ger Toshav. They're both Goyim. For this purpose, there's no nafkamina. The Ger Toshav, we try to hold him out, so we say we give him a nevela. But as far as Isser Lois Echanim, I think it would be the same. So deraisa, we think it's like an ideological thing. We're not allowed to sell land in Eretz Yisrael. I wonder how it works, though. I wonder if if you can like enter into a partnership with a guy to buy land in Eretz Yisrael, then you can't, because ultimately you can't sell it to him. So you can never go out of your chelik of the partnership. It's just I'm just wondering because it's not like a isser that I ever saw mentioned. I never saw anyone halacha l'maisa talking about this isser of selling land to a guy. Maybe it's only bisman beis hamikdash. I don't think so. Sagt Gemara weiter. B'Surya, so then the next din of Reb Meir was that in Surya, maskirim bottom. He said you can't rent anything in Eretz Yisrael, but in Surya you could rent a house, but you can't rent a sada. Maishna mechira delay. So he said, why is it that in Surya you can rent but not sell? Mishum mechira Eretz Yisrael. Because we're worried that you're going to also come to sell in Eretz Yisrael. Ihachi miskiris nami nigzer. Why don't we make the same zera that if you rent in Surya, you'll come to rent in Eretz Yisrael, and like we said, renting in Eretz Yisrael is also in the first part of the first din of the Mishnah. So he gufa gzera v'anan neikav nigzer gzera l'gzera. You don't make a gzera l'gzera. That would be two steps. You'd have to say we're worried that if he rents in Surya, he'll come to sell in Surya, or he'll come to rent in Eretz Yisrael, and then he'll come to sell in Eretz Yisrael. In fact, the Gemara, Vaskir Sada de Besurya, the Gzera l'Gzerahi, because Gazrinan. If that's the case, if he's saying that you don't do, the Gemara set it up. If we say you don't do Gzera l'Gzera, what's the problem with renting a Sada in Surya? A Sada in Surya, even if you were to come sell it, it would not be a problem because it's outside of Eretz Yisrael. There's no Meiser in Chutz La'aretz. We hold it's not part of Eretz Yisrael. And if you would come to rent in Eretz Yisrael, again, there's no problem. The whole problem in Eretz Yisrael of renting a sada or a bias is just that you might come to sell it. So it's always a gzera l'gzera. V'kol gazrinan. So tomorrow halas hasam lav gzeru. He says over there it's not a gzera, meaning not that it's not a gzera. He wants to say that the Isser in Surya, the original Isser of selling in Surya would not be Xera. It would be Ikar Adin. Kasavar Kivish Yachid Shmei Kivas. He holds that, we're saying now that Remeir holds that Taka, Surya, is part of Eretz Yisrael. When David HaMelech conquered it, it did make it part of Eretz Yisrael. So Midarais it's us. Sad is betati gazer be rabban. Bottom bless betati le gazer behu rabbanim. So he says that Einachanami Remeyataka holds midaraisa it's awesome, but it goes back to maskir lehem bottom. You can still, however, you can be masker a bias. Now, then the question becomes, what is the difference? Why do we say that in Chutz La'aretz, according to Remeir, I'm sorry, not in Chutz La'aretz, in Eretz Yisrael itself, we say ein maskirim bata, and over here, and it's because it's a Isser Daraisa, and Surya we don't. So the issue. So the issue is, it's hard to understand. I guess even though he holds, it must be that Kivish Yachid, even though it's Aser, still is not at the same level as the Isser in Eretz Yisrael. Well, there's some suffix in it, right? Why, in the end, why would he say? He said we're not geyser. The Gemara is saying that according to Rameh, we're not geyser in Surya because it's only one Isser. It's only Isser L'Isechanim. But in Eretz Yisrael, that didn't stop us. Yeah. It could be. It could be that. So what I'm thinking. Yeah, it's puzzling. It's a little hard to understand. Yeah, okay, but that's his conclusion. Then we continue to Chutz La'aretz according to Rameh. But Chutz La'aretz, Sada de Isbei Tarti, Gazru Rabbanim. So a Sada that has both things, then though the Chama were Geyser in Chutz La'aretz, right? Because in Chutz La'aretz, Rameir has said, Moichel Lehem Batan, you could even sell a house, because a house, even selling it in Chutz La'aretz is no problem at all. The only question is maybe you'll come to sell it in Eretz Yisrael. So the Chum were not geyser, it's so far from Eretz Yisrael, they were not geyser even on Mechira. But a Sada that has two Isurim, they were geyser that you can't sell. But renting, you can, I'm sorry, but you can still rent because they're not scared that if you rent in Chutz La'aretz, you're going to come to sell in Eretz, to rent in Eretz Yisrael and then sell in Eretz Yisrael. We don't go so far. Rabbi Yossi, then we turn. The Gemara turns to Rabbi Yossi's shita. Rabbi Yossi be'eretz Yisrael maskin lehem bottom. He says in Eretz Yisrael you can rent a house. My timer. Saw this bit isbu tarti gazu rabbanan. Bottom bless butarti legazu rabbanan. Again, it's the same. It's the same svara, just one step removed. He says that Rameir had said with geyser on schiras bottom, even though it's only one iser. But it's in Eretz Yisrael, you're only one step away. One Isser is enough to be geyser. He holds no. Since there's only one Isser, one possible Isser by bottom, there's no the Chum saw no need to make a Gzera against Chirs. Well, Surya, Meichrin, we said in Surya, you can, according to Rabbi Yossi, Meichrin bottom maskirun sadis. He says the same thing that we said in Chutz La'aretz in Rameh, that's what we say according to Rabbi Yossi in Surya. My timer, he holds not like we concluded in Rameh that Surya is part of Eretz Yisrael. He holds it's not part of Eretz Yisrael. Sada dispatati gazur rabbanan. However, Sada that there are two Isurim, they were geyser that Rabbi Yossi said you cannot sell it. Bottom less utati legazur rabbanan. They have no gzeira at all. And you could even sell. B'chutzlar and Meichrim, we said in Chutzlar you can sell altogether. My timer, since it's far away, there's no gzeira at all. Amar Yudam Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Yossi. He said passes halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. Amar Rabbi Yossi, well vashla yasen shkuna. There's only one t'nai in that. You can't sell a house and make it the third house that belongs to a guy. If you make three houses together that belong to Goyim, then they're going to take over the neighborhood, and they're going to threaten the Jews nearby. This is talking about a place where Yidden are living. You cannot sell the third house. You're not allowed what we used to call, maybe, and I think Lizzie's going to be the only one to know this term, blockbusting. You remember from East Flatbush. You can't do blockbusting. The Kamashchuna, Tana ain't shchuna pchusa mishloishim ne'adam. Anything less than three is not a shchuna. V'lachos doma azal hai Yisrael u'mazvan l'charay v'kechavim v'azal eich u'mazvan l'letrei. Gemara asks, how do you know? Let's say you sell a 3-acre property to a non-Jew in a shchuna. Maybe he'll go and resell it. He'll keep an acre for himself and sell 2 acres, each acre to another non-Jew, and you'll end up having 3 non-Jews together. Amar Abaya lifnei mafkadinan alifnei delifnei loy mafkadinan. We use the way Taisa says. Taisa says alifnei delifnei lafkadinan hay simna ba'amu l'kuli hay loy chayshinan. He says even though we're using the lashon of lifnei iver, a lifnei iver chayshinan, which comes from the lashon of the pasuk of lifnei iver, we don't really mean lifnei iver. It's not an issue of lifnei iver. We're just co-opting that lashon. Inami kivin deser shchuna shel yavai hizik. I'm sorry, that's the wrong thing. Yeah, we call it a michshel, even though it's not lifnei iver, but it's going to cause a hezek. That's the reason why when medame it to lifnei iver, you're causing a michshel to the Yidden who are living there. Zech Gemara, Mechlal de'ika. after we said Afa Makom Shem Amru Lahaska, the end of the Mishnah was even in a place that they said that you can rent. From that you see that there are some places where you can't rent a house. So this continuation of the Mishnah that says that in a place that you rent, you can't rent it as a base dira, has to be Kareb Meir, because we're saying a place that you do rent. Mashma is a place that you don't rent. According to the Rabbi Yossi b'chol duchtei mugri. Rabbi Yossi holds that you're always able to rent a house. Even in Eretz Yisrael, you could rent a house. So this formulation would not make sense. The Gemara continues. B'chol makom lo yiskar. We said you can't rent a merchatz to a Ovid Kechavim, and the Mishnah had said the reason because he's going to work in it. Tanya, Shimon Li'alemer, Yiskar Adam Merchatz lo Ovid Kechavim Nation Nikra al Shmai, because it's still caused. If he rents it to a non-Jew, it's still going to be called by the name of the Yid. And now we end the Mishnah didn't say the reasoning, but now we say the full reasoning. It's called by his name, and the Ovid Kechavim is going to work on it on your Shabbos and Yom Tov. Aval my shari. The Gemara says from the fact that we said Ovid Kechavim, we didn't say a kuti. A kuti is someone who is Megayer. They're not careful about halachas that come from drashas. They only really follow they're a little bit like the tztukim, that they only follow Torah shebiksav. But it sounds like it's mutter. In fact, the Gemara kuti ema avid bei malachta b'chol shomayit. Why aren't we worried that a kuti is going to run the Beis HaMerchatz and Chol HaMoed? Because they're not careful about Chol HaMoed. The Isra of Chol HaMoed is only learned out from drashas. So the Gemara b'chol shomayit anan nami avdinin. He says, what kind of question is that? Chol HaMoed, you're allowed to run a Beis HaMerchatz. You're allowed to take a shower on Chol HaMoed, so it's not a problem. So it's a strange Gemara. The good Taisus, I think, asks that what's the chiddush of it? Everyone knows that you can use why would he ask such a question? The Gemara says that bottom you can't sell to Ovid Kechavim because, like we said, they're going to. I'm sorry, a merchatz. It's aser because it's called al shmai, but a sada, it's not called al shmai. That you could rent to Ovid Kechavim, meaning in those places where the surim of the Mishnah don't apply, depending on the circumstances. In Chutz La'aretz, according to Rabbi Yossi, Sazak the Gemara, Shari, my time Arisa Arisuse Ka'avid. So the reason why a sada would be mutter, it wouldn't have this problem of Beis HaMerchatz that's Nikra al Shmai, is because you say that the person who's working on it is an aris. And an aris, Ovid Kechavim, is allowed to work on the land of a Yid on Shabbos and Yom Tovim because he's working for himself. Why don't we have the same issue? Why don't we say that the Beis HaMerchatz, why do we assume people will say it's asur, and maybe they'll think that it's an arisus, which is mutter. Arisa is a sharecropper who gets a share of the profits. So it's not so typical that someone will work as a aris on a Beis HaMerchatz. Okay, we're going to have to continue on the dinim of arisas and kablonis of a Beis HaMerchatz and the property of a Yid on Shabbos tomorrow, B'ez Hashem.
Thank you. Have a great day.